There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They knock on the door dressed in the plain clothes of a Tuesday evening, or a casual remark, or a simple, logical suggestion. You let them in because you have no reason not to. They are mundane, practical. They are a solution to a small problem. A friend who needs a place to crash, a shared meal to avoid cooking for one, a bed big enough for two on a cold night. You don't realize that these ordinary moments are carrying the entire weight of your future in their pockets. You don't know that when you invite them over the threshold, they are rearranging the furniture of your soul, quietly, while you are not looking. And then one day you wake up, and the room is the same, but the light falls differently on everything, and you understand that nothing will ever be ordinary again. For me, that moment had a name and a voice, and it said, with a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes, "Let's just share the bed, man." I don't bite. He was wrong about that. He bit my shoulder at 3 in the morning, and it was not a bite of aggression, or of passion, or even of clear, conscious intent. It was a bite of belonging. It was the kind of absent, proprietary little nip you might give to something you have held so often and for so long that you have forgotten it is not an extension of your own body. It was sleepy and strange, and it sent a tremor through my entire nervous system, a quiet earthquake that started in the muscle of my shoulder and radiated out to the tips of my fingers and toes. I lay there in the dark, every cell in my body humming with a high, thin wire of alarm and a deep, resonant chord of something I could only name as hope. His arm was slung heavy and warm across my waist, his face tucked into the space between my neck and the pillow, and his breathing was the slow, steady rhythm of the tides against the shore of my back. It was the most dangerous place I had ever been, and I had never, in my entire life, felt so profoundly safe. This was the paradox of Josh. He was a walking contradiction, a man built of solid lines and blurry edges. To understand how we ended up in that bed, with the ghost of his teeth on my skin and a universe of unspoken things hanging in the air between us, you have to understand the architecture of our friendship. We had built it carefully over a decade, a structure designed for shelter, not for habitation. It had clear windows, sturdy walls, and a door that was always left slightly ajar, but never fully opened. I was the quiet observer of this construction, the one who took mental photographs of its progress, noting the stress fractures and the load-bearing beams. I was the one who knew its blueprints by heart, because, in secret, I had been in love with its primary architect for years. We met in college, in a cavernous lecture hall that smelled of stale coffee and scholastic dread. I was a photography major, a creature of quiet corners and captured light, more comfortable behind a lens than in front of anyone's direct gaze. My world was a series of frames, of compositions, of moments frozen and analyzed. Josh was a force of nature. He was a software engineering student, but played soccer for the university, and he moved through the world with an easy, athletic grace that seemed to bend the space around him. He was all bright, kinetic energy, a blur of motion and quick laughter that drew people into his orbit effortlessly. He sat down next to me on the first day of a mandatory literature class, not because the seat was special, but because it was empty. He'd dropped his pen, and it had rolled under my chair. I'd retrieved it for him, and he'd flashed me a smile that was so genuinely, blindingly brilliant it felt like a physical impact. "Thanks, man," he'd said. "I'm Josh. Liam." I'd managed, my voice feeling small and inadequate in the face of his sun-drenched charisma. That was the beginning. Our friendship wasn't a sudden, dramatic event. It was a slow erosion. He was the current, and I was the stone. He wore away my defenses with a persistent, gentle friction I was barely aware of. We became study partners, our vastly different disciplines creating a strange but effective symbiosis. He would debug my pathetic attempts at coding for a required web design class, his fingers flying across the keyboard with an innate understanding I found mystifying, while I would help him dissect poetry, finding the hidden structures and emotional skeletons within the verses, something he claimed his logical brain couldn't process. We spent long nights in the library, fueled by vending machine snacks and a shared, unspoken understanding that we were both a little bit lonely, orbiting the vibrant social life of the university, but never quite docking. He was too busy with practice and a demanding course load. I was too introverted by nature. In the quiet hum of the library's fluorescent lights, we found a common ground, a small, private island in the middle of a bustling sea. I can pinpoint the exact moment my feelings for him shifted, the moment the tectonic plates of our friendship groaned and one slipped beneath the other, triggering a seismic event in my own private world. It was junior year. We were at a party, one of the rare ones I'd allowed him to drag me to. The music was a physical force, a wall of bass that vibrated in your bones. The air was thick with sweat and cheap beer. I had retreated to the periphery, as I always did, my camera a shield in my hands. I was watching the room through my viewfinder, turning the chaos into a series of still, manageable compositions. And then I found him. He was across the room, caught in a brief pocket of clear space. Someone had just told a joke, and he was laughing, his head thrown back, his throat exposed, the colored lights from the makeshift dance floor catching the sharp line of his jaw. It wasn't the big, performative laugh he used in large groups. It was his real laugh, a deep, genuine sound of unguarded joy. And in that frozen fraction of a second, the world fell away. The noise, the people, the cloying smell, it all dissolved. There was only him, perfectly framed, a masterpiece of light and shadow and life. It was not a thought. It was a physical blow, a punch to the sternum that knocked the air from my lungs. Oh, that was it. Just oh. The quiet, devastating sound of a door I never knew existed creaking open in my chest. From that day forward, our friendship became a different kind of structure for me. It became a darkroom. I had this raw, exposed image of my feelings for him, and I had to keep it in total darkness, terrified that any stray sliver of light would overexpose it, would burn it into something ugly and undeniable and ruin everything. The friendship was the most important thing. I repeated that to myself like a mantra. It was the foundation, the one thing I couldn't bear to lose. So I learned to be a masterful editor of my own emotions. I cropped out the yearning from my gaze. I adjusted the color balance of my words, muting the warmth, enhancing the cool tones of platonic affection. I became a curator of harmless moments, carefully selecting which feelings to display and which to store away in the light-proof archives of my heart. Josh, for his part, was blissfully unaware of the frantic, secret work I was doing. He moved through our friendship with the same easy confidence he moved through the rest of his life. He dated, of course. There were a series of girlfriends, bright, pretty girls who orbited him for a time before spinning off into their own trajectories. I was the constant, the fixed point. I was the one he called when a date went badly, the one he celebrated with when a project was a success. I was his best friend. The role came with a uniform, and I wore it dutifully. When he started dating Sarah during our senior year, it felt more serious. She was smart, ambitious, and she seemed to understand his restlessness in a way the others hadn't. They moved in together after graduation. He got a high-paying job as a software consultant, a role that sent him flying across the country for weeks at a time. I found a small, beautiful apartment with incredible morning light and started my career as a freelance photographer. Our lives diverged, but the foundation held. Whenever he was back in town, my apartment was his first stop. He'd drop his bags by the door, raid my fridge, and collapse onto my couch, exhaling as if he'd been holding his breath since he left. My space became his sanctuary, the place where the consultant, the boyfriend, the high achiever could dissolve and just be Josh. I treasured these times, even as they carved a hollow ache into my ribs. It was a bittersweet arrangement. I had him, but I didn't. I was the harbor, but never the destination. Then came the shift. The catalyst arrived, as they so often do, without fanfare, on a rainy Thursday in October. It came in the form of a phone call. I was in my darkroom, the red safe light casting an infernal glow on my hands as I gently agitated a tray of developer, watching an image of a winter landscape slowly emerge from the blank white paper. My phone, left on the counter outside, began to buzz, a frantic, insistent vibration against the wood. I sighed, finished my process, and went to answer it, wiping my chemical-smelling hands on my jeans. It was Josh. I almost let it go to voicemail, assuming it was just his standard, just landed, heading your way call. But something in the rapid, repeated buzzing felt different. Urgent. I answered. Liam. His voice was a wreck. It was thin and frayed, a rope stretched to its breaking point. Josh? What's wrong? Where are you? Can I? Can I come over? He asked, and the question was so full of broken glass I could feel it cutting me through the phone. I can't go home. He didn't say the word home, with its usual meaning, the apartment he shared with Sarah. He said it like it was a foreign country, a place he no longer had a passport for. Something had shattered. He arrived 20 minutes later, looking like a ship that had been dashed against the rocks. His clothes were rumpled, his hair was wet from the rain, and his eyes, his bright, confident eyes, were hollowed out, dark pools of exhaustion and pain. He wasn't carrying a suitcase. He was carrying the invisible, crushing weight of an imploded life. He didn't offer details, and I didn't ask for them. He just walked in, sank onto my couch, and stared at the opposite wall as if he were trying to project the last few hours of his life onto it. It was over with Sarah. That much was clear. It wasn't just a fight. It was a fundamental fracture. The future he had been mapping out, the one with her in it, had been erased. He was adrift, unmoored from the life he thought he was building. That night, he didn't just need my couch. He needed an anchor. He fell asleep there, mid-sentence, while trying to explain something about a canceled flight and a miscommunication. I watched him for a long time, his face, so often animated and alive, slack with a deep, troubled sleep. The sharp planes of his cheeks seemed softer, the confident set of his jaw undone by vulnerability. I carefully draped my favorite quilt over him, a heavy, hand-stitched thing my grandmother had made, and retreated to my bedroom, leaving the door open just a crack, listening to the sound of his breathing as it slowly evened out. It felt like standing watch, like guarding a fragile, precious thing. The architecture of our friendship was changing. A storm had come and blown out all the windows, and for the first time, he was seeking shelter not just in the building, but in the space right next to me. The couch became his bed for the next week. He'd go to work meetings during the day, a ghost in a well-tailored suit, and return to my apartment in the evening, the facade crumbling the moment he closed the door behind him. We fell into a new, somber rhythm. I would cook, simple, comforting things that didn't require much conversation. We would watch old movies, the familiar dialogue a buffer against the raw, painful silence. I became a student of his grief. I learned the different textures of his exhaustion. There was the sharp, jagged exhaustion from lack of sleep, and the heavy, sodden exhaustion of emotional depletion. I saw him wrestling with a loneliness that was new to him, a profound sense of being untethered that his constant motion and social grace had always managed to keep at bay. He was a man who had always had a destination, a plan. Now, his compass was spinning wildly, and my quiet, sunlit apartment was the only true north he had left. This was the beginning of the ritual, the slow, terrifying, and beautiful blurring of lines that I had spent years so carefully drawing. It started subtly. He would fall asleep on the couch, and I would find him later, curled into a tight ball, his long limbs contorted in the cramped space. One night, I found him shivering, the thin throw blanket he'd pulled over himself wholly inadequate. I stood there for a long moment, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. My bed was a queen, a wide, comfortable expanse of mattress and duvet. It was an island of warmth in the cool night air of the apartment. The thought was a spark, dangerous and bright. To offer it felt like crossing a line I had sworn to myself I would never approach. To not offer it felt, in that moment, like a form of cruelty. He stirred, a low groan in his throat, and his eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy with sleep and something deeper, a bone-deep weariness that seemed to radiate from him in waves. He looked at me, then at the couch, then back at me. A silent question passed between us. My voice, when I finally found it, was steadier than I felt. "You look cold," I said, "and uncomfortable. The couch is not meant for someone your size." He pushed himself up on one elbow, his hair a mess, his face etched with a vulnerability that made my chest ache. He looked towards my bedroom door, which I'd left open. He looked at the sliver of my bed visible from the living room, a sea of calm, white duvet. "I don't want to impose, man," he whispered, his voice rough. And there it was. The moment. The ordinary, practical suggestion that would change everything. I took a breath, a small, shaky thing. "It's a big bed," I said, my words feeling both monumental and ridiculously simple. "There's plenty of room." He hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Maybe it was doubt. Maybe it was just exhaustion. Then, he offered that small, broken laugh, the one that didn't have any light in it. Okay, he said. Let's just share the bed, man. I don't bite. The first night was an exercise in excruciating awareness. I felt like a spy in my own bed. Every nerve ending was on high alert, cataloging data. The dip in the mattress where his weight settled. The faint, clean scent of his soap. The sound of his breathing, so close now, a soft puff of air against the back of my neck. We lay with our backs to each other, a rigid, uncrossable chasm of sheet and blanket between us. It was a parody of intimacy. We were closer than we had ever been, yet the distance felt immense, a carefully policed border between two sovereign nations. I lay awake for hours, my body stiff as a board, terrified of moving, of breathing too loudly, of accidentally brushing against him in my sleep. I was cataloging the silence, trying to interpret its language. Was it a comfortable silence, or a tense one? Was this a mistake? I was a photographer in a darkroom with a new, volatile chemical. I had no idea if it would develop the image or burn the whole thing to ash. But Josh, broken and exhausted as he was, fell asleep almost instantly. His body, finally allowed to stretch out, sank into a deep, profound rest. And in that rest, the rigid boundaries he maintained while awake began to soften. The second night was much the same, a careful dance of avoidance in the shared space. But by the third night, the ritual began to evolve. I woke in the middle of the night to a strange warmth against my calf. In his sleep, his leg had drifted across the no-man's land between us, his foot resting gently against mine. It was nothing. It was everything. It was a simple, unconscious act of a sleeping body seeking warmth, and it was a message sent from his subconscious directly to my overactive heart. I lay there, not daring to move, my own foot a live wire against his, until the sun began to paint the sky in shades of gray and blue outside my window. I was learning a new kind of photography, one that didn't involve a camera. I was capturing these moments, these fleeting touches, these shifts in the atmosphere, and developing them in the quiet, secret space of my own mind, trying to understand what image was slowly, painstakingly coming into focus. The ritual deepened. The chasm between us narrowed with each passing night. It was a slow, geological process, the continental drift of two lonely bodies. One night, I woke to find him turned towards me, his face only inches from mine, his breath a warm, sweet ghost on my cheek. I could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the way his eyelashes rested against his skin. It was an intimacy so acute it was almost painful. I held my breath, memorizing the cartography of his sleeping face, the slope of his nose, the curve of his mouth. It felt like theft, like I was stealing a glimpse of something I had no right to see. But he was the one who had turned towards me. He was the one closing the distance, even if it was only in the unpatrolled landscape of his dreams. Then came the night of the arm. I was drifting in that hazy space between wakefulness and sleep when I felt a weight settle across my middle. It was heavy, solid, and unequivocally his. He had rolled over completely, his front pressed against my back, and had slung his arm over my waist, pulling me slightly closer to him. My entire body went rigid. This was different. This was not an accidental brush of a foot. This was an embrace. A sleeping, unconscious embrace, but an embrace nonetheless. His hand rested on my hip, his fingers loosely curled. I could feel the heat of his palm through the thin cotton of my t-shirt. My heart was a trapped bird, beating its wings frantically against the cage of my ribs. This is just for comfort, I told myself. He's been through a trauma. He's seeking physical reassurance, the way a child seeks a parent in the dark. It doesn't mean anything. It's a reflex. But my body didn't believe my brain's logical, desperate explanations. My body responded with a flood of warmth that had nothing to do with the heat of his. My skin tingled where he touched me. I was terrifyingly, incandescently aware of every point of contact. The press of his chest against my shoulder blades, the line of his legs against mine, the impossible weight of his arm holding me in place. I lay there, trapped and sheltered all at once, until my panic subsided into a slow, humming current of pure, unadulterated longing. This was what I had secretly wanted for years, a fantasy so deeply buried I had barely allowed myself to acknowledge it. And here it was, real and warm and breathing against my back, offered up by his sleeping self. a gift he would have no memory of giving. I didn't sleep for the rest of an hour, maybe more, just soaking in the impossible reality of it, branding the feeling into my memory. This became the new norm. He would start the night on his side of the bed, and by morning, I would wake up with him wrapped around me, or with me tucked against his chest, his chin resting on the top of my head. We never spoke of it. The mornings were a delicate dance of pretense. We would wake, untangle ourselves with a careful, unspoken choreography, and pretend that we had both slept soundly and separately. We'd make coffee, talk about the day ahead, and studiously ignore the profound intimacy that had occurred just hours before. The plausible deniability was a shield for us both. For him, it allowed him to receive the comfort he so desperately needed without having to confront what it might mean. For me, it allowed me to have this small, secret piece of him without risking the destruction of our friendship. We were living in a glass house, and we both knew it, but we were both pretending we couldn't see the cracks spreading across the panes. And then, the bite. It was a Tuesday, about 3 weeks into this strange, new cohabitation. He'd had a particularly brutal day. A conference call with a client in a different time zone had gone badly. He had come home looking hollowed out, the ghost of his professional mask still clinging to him. We ate dinner in near silence. I could feel the tension radiating from him, a low, anxious hum. Later, in bed, he was restless. He tossed and turned, his limbs twitching with residual stress. I lay on my side, facing away from him, giving him space, pretending to be asleep. Around 3 in the morning, he finally settled. He rolled towards me, his body seeking its now familiar harbor. He pressed himself against my back, his arm came around my waist, and his face found the curve of my neck. He let out a long, slow sigh, a sound of surrender. I felt his lips brush against my shoulder, a feather-light touch. And then he bit me. It wasn't hard. It was a gentle pressure, a firm, toothy nuzzle that lasted for a second, maybe 2. It was the mark of a creature claiming its territory in its sleep. It was possessive and tender and utterly baffling. And it broke something in me. The carefully constructed walls of my denial, the intricate system of platonic explanations I had built, they all came crashing down. An accidental touch is one thing. A sleeping embrace can be explained away as a search for warmth. But a bite? A bite is specific. A bite is an action, however unconscious. It felt like a message from the deepest, most honest part of him, a part that was not bound by fear or confusion or the expectations of the world. It was a confession made in a language his waking mind wouldn't dare to speak. I lay there in the vibrating silence, the faint impression of his teeth a warm, tingling brand on my skin. The hope that I had kept locked away for so long, the hope I had starved and disciplined into submission, was now roaring. It was a wild, untamable thing, and it was demanding to be acknowledged. The plausible deniability was gone. The glass house had shattered. I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that we could not go on like this. The silence had become too loud. The unspoken thing between us had grown too large for the room. Something had to be said. A door had been opened, and I was no longer willing to pretend I didn't see the light pouring through. The days that followed were thick with a new kind of tension. The air in the apartment felt charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm. The easy, if somber, rhythm we had found was replaced by a stilted, careful awkwardness. We were both acutely aware that a line had been crossed, even if neither of us knew how to name it. The morning after the bite, he was quieter than usual. He kept his eyes on his coffee cup, his shoulders hunched. I watched him, my own shoulders still humming with the phantom pressure, and I saw the confusion warring with the exhaustion in his face. He knew something had shifted. He just didn't have the map for this new territory. Neither did I, but I knew I couldn't be the one to guide us through it. The risk was too great. If I pushed, if I asked, if I named the thing that had happened, he could retreat so far I might never find him again. The friendship, that precious, foundational structure, was still the thing I was most afraid to lose. So I waited. I waited for him to speak the first word, to make the first move in the daylight that would acknowledge the secret language of the night. The waiting was a special kind of torture. It was like holding a photograph in a tray of developer for too long, watching the image darken past its ideal point, threatening to become an unrecognizable black square. The tension was building, and I feared it would spoil the delicate image of what we could be. We continued to share the bed, but the ritual was different now. It was fraught. The unconscious, sleepy comfort had been replaced by a hyper-awareness. When he would roll over and his arm would drape over me, I could feel the slight hesitation in the movement. I could feel him wake up for a split second, realize where he was and what he was doing, and then make a conscious, deliberate choice to stay. It was no longer an accident. It was a decision, remade every night in the quiet dark. The breaking point came on a Saturday. He had been back in town for almost a month. There was no more talk of him finding a new place, no mention of the life he had lost. My apartment had simply become his home. We had spent the day in a comfortable, almost domestic silence. I worked in my darkroom, and he sat at my kitchen table with his laptop, tapping away at some complex web of code. The late afternoon sun streamed through the large living room window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, turning them into a galaxy of tiny, glittering stars. I came out of the darkroom, blinking in the sudden brightness, and found him not at the table, but standing by the window, staring out at the city below. His laptop was closed. His shoulders were slumped. He looked profoundly lost. I walked over and stood beside him, not touching, just sharing the view. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything we hadn't said for weeks. It was a physical presence in the room. Finally, he turned his head and looked at me. His face was stripped bare of all its usual defenses. The confident consultant, the easygoing athlete, they were gone. In their place was just Josh, scared and uncertain, and so incredibly vulnerable it made my breath catch in my throat. His gaze dropped from my eyes to my mouth, and it stayed there for a beat too long. It was a question, stark and terrifying and hopeful. In that moment, I understood that the architecture of our friendship, the building I had so carefully maintained and protected, was a ruin. It was a beautiful, noble ruin, but a ruin nonetheless. We could not live in it anymore. We had to build something new or walk away from the wreckage entirely. And I knew, with a clarity that was as sharp and painful as a shard of glass, that I could not walk away. All my years of self-protection, of guarding my heart, of prioritizing the safety of our friendship above my own feelings, it all collapsed into a single, simple truth. I would rather risk everything for the possibility of something more than live forever in the safe, hollow echo of what we had been. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just held his gaze, and I let everything I had kept hidden for a decade rise to the surface. I let him see the yearning, the fear, the deep, unwavering affection. I took down all the walls. It was the most terrifying act of my life. I was handing him the power to utterly destroy me. He saw it. I watched his expression change, a slow dawning of comprehension that was mixed with his own profound fear. He took a small, almost imperceptible step closer. The space between us was electric. "Liam," he whispered, and my name was a prayer, a plea, an apology. He leaned in, his movements agonizingly slow, giving me every possible chance to turn away, to put the walls back up, to retreat to the safety of our old friendship. It would have been so easy to laugh it off, to clap him on the shoulder and ask what was for dinner. It would have been so easy to save myself. I did not. I stood my ground, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. I met him halfway. The kiss was not what I had imagined. In my secret, foolish fantasies, it had always been something passionate, dramatic, a sudden cinematic release of years of pent-up feeling. But it was none of those things. It was quiet. It was tentative. It was unbelievably soft. It was just the gentle pressure of his lips against mine, a hesitant question. It tasted of coffee and uncertainty and a deep, soul-shaking relief. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of confession. It said, "I am scared." It said, "I don't understand this." It said, "But I am here." And I kissed him back, a silent response that said, "I know. Me too. Stay." We stood there in the golden afternoon light, in the wreckage of our friendship and on the foundation of something new. And we just held each other, the kiss deepening into something more certain, a slow, gentle exploration of a territory we had both just discovered we owned. It felt like coming home. The morning after the kiss was a landscape of blinding, beautiful terror. I woke up first, as I usually did. The light was just beginning to seep into the room, soft and gray. Josh was still asleep, his arm thrown over my chest, his head on my shoulder. His face, in the dim light, was peaceful. For a few blissful, hazy seconds, it felt like any other morning in our new ritual. Then the memory of the kiss, of the conversation that followed, stilted, hopeful, terrified words whispered in the dark, came rushing back. We had crossed the line. We had acknowledged the unspoken thing. And now, in the harsh light of day, I had no idea what came next. I lay there, listening to the city slowly waking up outside, my mind a whirlwind of hope and anxiety. What if he regretted it? What if, in the daylight, this all seemed like a huge, confusing mistake to him? When I finally slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him, I found a note on the kitchen counter, propped against the sugar bowl. My heart sank before I even read it. Notes were for avoidance. The handwriting was a familiar, hasty scrawl. Had to catch an early flight. Emergency at the Chicago office. Talk soon. J. Talk soon. The two most promising and damning words in the English language. I read the note 3 times, trying to decipher its hidden meaning, to find a clue in the slant of the letters or the pressure of the pen. But it was just a note. A logistical fact. An escape. The warmth of the previous evening began to leach out of me, replaced by a familiar, creeping cold. He had run. The moment it became real, the moment it had a name and a place in the daylight world, he had bolted. The beautiful, fragile thing we had built the night before felt like it was turning to dust in my hands. The week that followed was one of the longest of my life. It was a masterclass in the art of miscommunication. His texts were brief, professional, landed safely. Meetings are a nightmare. Project is on fire. They were reports from a distant country, full of facts and devoid of feeling. He didn't mention the kiss. He didn't mention the whispered confessions. He didn't mention us. It was as if it had never happened. He was trying to put the lid back on Pandora's box, to pretend we had never looked inside. And with every short, sterile message, my hope dwindled. The photographer in me saw the image fading, the chemicals failing, the picture dissolving back into blank white paper. I began to believe I had imagined it all, that I had misinterpreted his desperation for affection, his loneliness for love. I felt like a fool, an arrogant, hopeful fool who had overexposed the moment and ruined the one thing he had sworn to protect. The silence from him on the subject was a deafening roar in my head, and my apartment, once our shared sanctuary, felt vast and empty and haunted by the ghost of a possibility. I cycled through a storm of emotions. Hurt, sharp and piercing. Anger, a hot, bitter thing that curdled in my stomach. And underneath it all, a deep, profound sadness. I had let myself hope, and the fall from that height was brutal. By the time he texted, a week later, wrapping up here. Flight lands at 7. I had rebuilt some of my walls, mortaring them with resignation and hurt pride. I was preparing myself to have the let's just forget this happened and be friends conversation, a conversation that I knew would feel like swallowing broken glass. He arrived at my door looking even more exhausted than he had when this whole ordeal began. He was wearing the armor of his job, the crisp shirt, the tired but determined expression. He was holding his suitcase. He tried for a smile, but it was a weak, flimsy thing that collapsed almost immediately. "Hey man," he said, his voice strained. "Good to be back." He made a move to step inside, to fall back into the old rhythm, to drop his bags and collapse on the couch and pretend. But I didn't move. I stood in the doorway, blocking his path. I couldn't do it. I couldn't go back to the pretense. The silence had festered for too long. "No," I said, my voice quiet but firm. It stopped him cold. He looked at me, his eyes widening with a flicker of panic. "What do you mean, no?" he asked. "We're not doing this, Josh," I said, my heart pounding. I was terrified, but the pain of the last week had burned away some of my fear. "We're not going to pretend that last Saturday didn't happen. We're not going to pretend you didn't spend a week acting like I don't exist. I can't do that. It's not fair. To either of us." He flinched, the words landing like physical blows. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the scuffed toe of his shoe. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I could see the battle raging inside him, the war between his ingrained fear and the truth he had been running from. "I'm sorry," he finally whispered, the words barely audible. "Liam, I'm so sorry. I'm so messed up." "I know you are," I said, my voice softening. The anger was gone, replaced by the familiar ache of wanting to comfort him, even as he was the source of my pain. But you can't use me as a temporary fix and then throw me away when it gets too real. My feelings aren't a layover. They're a destination. And if you can't handle that, you need to tell me now. So I can move on. The word feelings hung in the air between us, the first time I had ever said it aloud to him. It was a gamble, all my cards on the table. His composure finally broke. His shoulders slumped, and he rested his forehead against the doorframe, a shudder running through his body. "I'm scared," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I've spent my whole life on a track. College, job, girlfriend, future. It was all laid out. I knew who I was supposed to be, and then it all fell apart. And being here, with you, it's the only thing that has felt real in months. That kiss, it felt more like home than my actual home ever did. And that terrifies me, because it's not on the map. It's not part of the plan. I don't know who I am if I'm the guy who is in love with his best friend." He said it. He actually said it. In love with his best friend. The words hit me with the force of a physical shock. He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading vulnerability. "I ran because I'm a coward," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't know how to be that person. I still don't. But the thought of losing you, of you moving on, that's scarier than any of it." The walls I had started to rebuild crumbled into dust. All the hurt, all the anger, it all dissolved in the face of his raw, painful honesty. This wasn't a rejection. It was a terrified confession. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. I reached out and gently took his hand, his fingers cold and trembling in mine. "So don't run," I said softly. "Stay. Be a coward with me. We can figure it out together." A single tear escaped and traced a path through the travel grime on his cheek. He nodded, a jerky, desperate movement. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." I stepped aside and let him into the apartment, and as he crossed the threshold, it felt different this time. He wasn't a guest seeking temporary shelter. He was finally, truly, coming home. The conversation that night was the beginning of our new foundation. It wasn't easy. It was a hesitant, fumbling exploration of years of unspoken feelings and newfound fears. We sat on the couch, a careful foot of space between us, as if we were relearning how to exist in the same room. He talked about the suffocating pressure he'd felt his whole life to follow a pre-written script. The shock of realizing his feelings for me weren't a symptom of his breakup with Sarah, but a deep, underlying truth he had been subconsciously suppressing for years. He confessed that the nights in my bed, the unconscious seeking of comfort, had been his soul reaching for something his mind was too afraid to acknowledge. I, in turn, confessed my own history. I told him about the party in college, the moment I saw him through my camera lens and my world tilted on its axis. I told him about the years of careful self-editing, the fear of ruining the most important friendship I had ever had. I told him about the night of the bite, how it had felt like a secret message, a crack in his carefully constructed facade that let the truth shine through. As we spoke, the space between us on the couch slowly disappeared. A hand found another. A head eventually came to rest on a shoulder. We were rebuilding, not with brick and mortar, but with fragile, honest words, creating a new structure designed not just for shelter, but for a shared life. That night, when we went to bed, it was different. There was no pretense, no plausible deniability. He turned to me in the dark, his eyes luminous, and he asked, his voice soft and full of a new, tentative certainty, "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" It was the question he should have asked a week ago, and my heart swelled with a fierce, protective tenderness. I didn't answer with words. I just leaned in and gave him my reply. We fell asleep tangled together, not out of unconscious need, but out of deliberate, joyful choice. There was no chasm, no border. There was only us. The days that followed were a study in quiet domesticity. We were learning a new language of intimacy, one spoken in daylight. It was in the way he would wrap his arms around me from behind while I made coffee in the morning, resting his chin on my shoulder. It was in the way I would reach out and run my fingers through his hair while he worked at the kitchen table, a simple, grounding touch. It was in the shared smiles across the room, the comfortable silences that were no longer filled with tension, but with a deep, abiding peace. He was still scared. I could see it sometimes in the flicker of his eyes, but he was no longer running. He was staying. He was choosing to be here, with me, every single day. One afternoon, a few weeks later, I was in my darkroom. The familiar, alchemical smell of fixer and stop bath filled the air. The red safe light cast its gentle, otherworldly glow. I was working on a new series of self-portraits, trying to capture the subtle shifts in my own landscape. Josh knocked softly on the door before letting himself in, his larger frame filling the small space. He didn't speak, just came and stood behind me, his warmth a familiar comfort at my back. I was gently agitating a tray, watching an image slowly emerge from the milky depths of the developer. He wrapped his arms around my waist, mimicking the way he had held me so many times in his sleep. He rested his chin on my shoulder, the same shoulder he had once marked in the dark. We stood there together in the red-tinged silence, watching the photograph resolve. It was a picture of the two of us, taken on a self-timer a few days before. We were on the couch, laughing. His arm was around me, and my head was tilted against his chest. It was a simple, ordinary moment. But as the details sharpened, as the light and shadow found their final form, I saw it for what it was, a perfect, undeniable image of joy, of peace, of home. He pressed a soft kiss to the side of my neck, just above the spot he had once bitten. "It's a good one," he whispered, his voice a low rumble against my ear. I leaned back into him, my heart full and steady. "Yeah," I said, my own voice thick with emotion. "It is. We learn, eventually, that a home is not a place, but a presence. It is not a structure of wood and nails, but a framework of trust and acceptance. It is the quiet certainty of knowing you can be your most broken, your most confused, your most vulnerable self, and still be held." That night, years ago, when Josh had first suggested we share the bed, he had offered a simple, practical solution to a temporary problem. He had opened a door, thinking it only led to a spare room for the night. He didn't know, and I couldn't have dared to hope, that it was the door to the rest of our lives. We had stumbled through the dark, navigated the wreckage of our own fears, and found each other on the other side. And in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, we built a new home, one where the doors were never closed, and the light, soft and steady, fell on everything.